there are a lot of inspirations on A Song of Ice and Fire from real world. George is very well read, very much a fan of history, and of course it's not all history that he's influenced by. There's other things, fantasy novels, and science fiction, and just everything, really. Comic books, yeah, that's a big one, that's a huge one. And so we're obviously not able to cover all that in one 50-minute panel. So we're going to try to cover a few of that we're the most enthusiastic about, the ones we really know, and just try to tease a few others just to let you know that they exist in case you're not aware of any of them. You can kind of follow those rabbit holes, those threads yourself, because it's really quite a huge, expansive subject, and it's really fun to dive into because the things that make a lot of these things make A Song of Ice and Fire extra interesting. So if they're interesting to George, then they're probably going to be interesting to us. So just by that, I think it's a great place to start. Let's introduce ourselves and start kicking off some examples. I'm Aziz from the History of Westeros podcast, and I love history as well as A Song of Ice and Fire, so I'm really into this topic.
I'm Ray Ferry. I'm not from any podcast, but I'm a huge history buff as well. I became like that close majoring in history in college until I realized you actually don't make any money doing that. Other stuff. So yeah, that's actually one of the things.
So you can basically say, "Oh, if you support me, I'll give you a power tip. If you support me,
I'm Ladies' Point of View from the Westeros podcast, and I did major in history in college, and you're right. Therefore, I'm a podcaster. So I do love history and other things.
And I'm Lucifer Means Lightbringer. I go by LML, or just David, and I mostly look at Song of Ice and Fire for mythology and symbolism, but that occasionally leads me into the real world, so I glommed onto the topic, and I'm here to chip in a couple things. My podcast is called The Mythical Astronomy of Ice and Fire, because mythical astronomy means looking at the stars and then making myths, and that's what I'm all about.
Yeah. And real quick, you all should have gotten a raffle ticket on your way in. If anybody doesn't, please see the stunningly beautiful woman there with the black hair, otherwise known as my wife. She's passing out the tickets for you. We are going to be giving away one lucky winner this Arya Stark Emerald City Spring Convention exclusive pop. So,
Good to have around in case Night King shows up.
Exactly. She's got needle ready to go.
So probably perhaps the best, it's subjective, but one of the best examples that's really easy to point to because it's such a big physical thing, and the parallels are easy to see, is Hadrian's Wall in the north of England, kind of the barrier of, not really the barrier of Scotland and England, but it's sort of near there. And it was designed at the time, maybe for a multitude of purposes, but one of the stated purposes, certainly that history remembers it, was to keep out certain tribes in the north, the Picts and some others perhaps. And George, his method of writing fantasy, borrowing from history, is to take a real concept, dial it up to 11. So in this case, stone, no, ice. And then however high Hadrian's Wall is, he made it much, much higher. And that's the basis for a lot of these historical comparisons, whether they're real or historical. So with that example as our starter, we can move on to some other perhaps related ones.
Actually, can I add a bit on Hadrian?
Absolutely.
So the thing about Hadrian's Wall is that I think it's worth noting what it was that inspired George. It's not the height of the wall or the facts of the wall, it's the feeling that he got from standing at the wall, looking north, and imagining what it's like to just not know, like have these wild enemies that you can't face and you don't know when they're going to come, and it's the end of civilization. That feeling stuck with him and led to him creating the Wall of Westeros. And directly to that moment when Tyrion and Jon stand on the wall and basically have that conversation that George had with himself. So it's literally a real world influence in that George went to this place in the real world, was influenced, took that feeling and put it in his book. I think that's just really cool. So, yeah.
Right on.
Absolutely. Yeah, the Romans definitely looked at the Picts and the Scotty tribes and whatnot, i.e. the wildlings, as almost subhuman, not really worthy of them, and not even, I guess you could say, worthy of the deaths of Roman soldiers, even though they didn't tend to get too concerned about that. So they built the wall.
And that's not unlike how the Seven Kingdoms sees the wildlings. You see that parallel, it's pretty straightforward.
again, you
Look down on them. That's a very similar situation. So, which one do we want to start with?
You want to go for it?
Yeah, we can talk about War of the Roses. There's
You guys should share the mics since they're having a hard time here.
Okay, you guys hear us?
That mic doesn't seem to be working.
You know, they're not. You need to shift it back and forth or something.
Okay, you can start with it.
Okay, sure.
Pass it over to you.
Yeah, so obviously George has talked several times about, you know, the overriding influence when he started this trilogy, because it was originally supposed to be a trilogy, was the War of the Roses. I'll ask this real quick because we don't want to cover too much stuff. Is anybody here completely unfamiliar with the War of the Roses and what happened in England during those periods? Cool. Obviously it gets its name because of the sigils. I mean, this is essentially a war between cousins. And you know, one was a white rose, one was a red rose, and they both decided that they needed to have the throne. It all started, this is going to sound familiar, with the Mad King killing the father of the man who would become Edward IV when he won the throne. Initially in the battle, there was a lot of, well, I guess just like Song by Sapphire at this point, there was a lot of people that sat their butts on that throne before it was done. And that kind of spurred the whole thing, and really, you know, I don't know, I wasn't there, but you know, I would think his real motivation was really to avenge his father more than anything else. You know, it just so happened that to do that, he was going to have to take the throne. In the process of doing that, he married Elizabeth Woodville, who was a Lancastrian. So he was a York. They were fighting the Lancasters, i.e. Stark and Lannisters.
And the Yorkists were in the north, the Lancasters were in the south.
Just like Robb Stark married a bannerman of the Lannisters and lost the support of his men. Edward lost the support of a lot of his men. George actually, in the early books, really bases multiple characters on the same historical figures. So Robert Baratheon is sort of the older Edward, and Robb Stark is sort of the younger one. You know, never lost a battle, but basically never really held on to his kingdom very well at all, and never had the support, and kind of got, we talked about this, kind of got old and fat, and I can't remember exactly, I think he died of gout or something.
Yeah,
it was something really kind of crazy like that. So they really kind of drove that home, and you know, just kind of talking about the characters that all fit into that. Obviously, you have Robb as Edward. If you look at that, then you see Theon as George, because George was the brother that betrayed him, who, in my mind, had the absolute best form of execution ever, because he had his choice and he chose to be drowned in a vat of wine. So they basically put him headfirst in a vat of wine until he was dead. So, you know, I guess that was a peaceful way to go, sort of.
That's kind of a rock star way to go.
Yeah, that's what I'm like, why isn't that still an option today? And you forget, hey, just drown me in a vat of wine.
He had a sense that it would be memorable too. I think maybe you can give him credit for like, people are going to remember this. Okay, you're right.
The interesting thing that points out to me now is, okay, so if Theon's George and Robb was Edward, that makes Jon Snow Richard III. Okay? So, and when you think about it, you know, he was a sourpuss, he wasn't going on, there was, you know, rumors that he had relations with his niece, so, you know, a little of that going on, aunt, niece, kind of similar. And to me, that sort of maybe gives a prediction of how things might end up, you know, and if you kind of tie that into the whole Azor Ahai aspect of it. In the books, when you see Aemon passing, and he's talking about it's Daenerys, they were focusing on a man, but it's this girl. And so maybe she's the princess that was promised, and maybe she needs to sacrifice, you know, we haven't gotten there in the books yet, but maybe that's where things are going to end up.
Yeah.
And that's kind of just been on my mind lately, so we thought it would be interesting to kind of delve into the War of the Roses a little bit further.
Okay, so to add to that, we have a couple other details about Edward IV that are interesting. He was a really big guy, like you said. That was a good ruler afterwards. And there was a certain matter of maybe a marriage in secret that retroactively made all of his kids illegitimate. It's a bit of a historical conundrum, perhaps, or debate, whether it was legal or whether it even happened. And you can see clearly how that would fit into Song of Ice and Fire quite easily. And that with people having perhaps their claims either backed by armies or backed by law or neither. And you have the Lancasters and the Yorks obviously sounding like the Starks and the Lannisters. And then you have the dynasty that swoops in while they're fighting, and that's the Tudors, which is kind of an analog of the Targaryens here. And in this case, the Tudor dynasty was exiled to the mainland. Instead of being in England, they were in France at the time until he had a chance to go back. And England itself is take half of it and flip it and take Ireland and stick it on top, and you've got Westeros. Well, and you got to make it like 3 or 4 times bigger. But it all even lines up geographically like that. So there's a lot there. I don't want to get too much deeper into the War of the Roses because we have a couple other ones we're going to talk about. But Lady Gwyn, I know you maybe had a few thoughts as well on that.
I did. I wanted to mention something that, thank you. Something that is not considered a lot when you have these conversations about Wars of Roses. And we talked about in our recent podcast, Aziz and I, that is the origins of the Wars of the Roses and the origins of the Dance of the Dragons. You have a real world analog with Jaehaerys and Alysanne and King Edward III and his wife Philippa of England. They had almost identical 50-plus year reigns. They each had 13 children, many of whom did not survive their parents, and came down to the offspring of just 2 or 3 of each, who bequeathed claims to the throne, which became very problematic after, say, a couple of generations. Fewer generations in A Song of Ice and Fire, a little bit more stretched out in the real world. But ultimately, what it came down to was several people who were descended from this one notable king, who were cousins of each other, fighting out who had the better claim. Was it me because I'm descended from the daughter of a son that was Lionel the Duke of Clarence had a daughter. He was not the eldest son, the second eldest son of Edward III, who had a claim. His daughter had a claim, but she was passed over. Sounds very familiar to some of the themes from Dance of the Dragons. And then the third son was the Duke of Lancaster, and the fourth son was the Duke of York, and then their children, eventually after several generations, got into this struggle that we call the Wars of the Roses. At the time, they didn't necessarily call it that. Contemporary people called it the Wars of the Cousins. So it's really very similar. It's a close analog to the Dance of the Dragons. So something I'm sure was on George's mind when he was writing that.
If your question is on point, you want to get it real quick before
I
that.
just wanted to make an addition. I'm glad you mentioned the death of Philippe. George himself cites a series written by a French author, Maurice Druon.
Oh, yes.
Very good. 7 books. He says himself that the Starks and the Lannisters have nothing on Hadrian and
Yes,
exactly.
those are awesome books.
Yeah.
Well, Edward III marries Philippa in the 6th book. So,
Yeah. Okay.
For anyone who couldn't hear, George is heavily influenced by the real world series or the historical fiction series, The Accursed Kings by Maurice Druon, and the quote he gave was, "The Starks and the Lannisters have nothing on the Plantagenets and Capitans," right? Like that there. So, real quick, another connected point much earlier, just like the Starks and the Lannisters are going at each other early on in The Song of Ice and Fire, much longer before, there was the Dance of the Dragons, just like many years before the Wars of the Roses, there was the Anarchy, which involved a female claimant being skipped over for a male claimant, and neither of them were really good leaders, which is familiar to anyone who's read about the Dance of the Dragons and The Song of Ice and Fire. It was like one of the debates for the Greens and the Blacks in The Song of Ice and Fire comes down to they both suck. Like, they're both awful. It's not so different in the Anarchy during that same period in England, the parallel period in England, where neither side was ruling. And part of the reason it's called the Anarchy is because no one was enforcing the king's peace, enforcing the laws, and so bad people got there was outlaws, banditry, it's terrible.
So I want to make a couple of meta points about everything that we just talked about. 2 things. So one, the Dance of the Dragons and the War of the Five Kings both borrow elements from the War of the Roses. So what's cool is that George and specifically the point that one king doesn't have a clear heir, and so these multiple heirs end up going to war over the house. So when the first time we hear about the I'm sorry, I'm getting crossed up. So the Blackfire Rebellion, not the Dance of the Dragons. So the Blackfire Rebellion and the War of the Five Kings are both borrowing from the War of the Roses. And then George has Catelyn reference the Blackfire Rebellion to make the point to Robb about not having clear heirs. So it's very meta because it's George taking the same war, putting it in two places, and then having one person reference the other and saying, now make sure you pay attention to your history or else this can happen. So that's just kind of, like I said, it's very meta, so that's kind of fun. And then the other thing is that the War of the Roses, so these characters, it's never one-to-one, right? Like you were saying, Robert's, this one guy's spread out between Robert and Robb both, right? And they're both called Robb. But and the thing is, A Song of Ice and Fire isn't just War of the Roses. It's also, obviously, a lot of myth. It's a lot of, we found comics, we found Batman stuff, old Marvel comics, because George was really into Marvels in the 60s and 70s. We found all kinds of stuff in there. Euron is kind of like Doctor Strange and this other dude, I forget his name because I don't know the 70s Marvel as well, but the point is George is a synthesizer. And so when he creates Robert Baratheon, he's a little bit Thor, and he's also a little bit the Green Man with his antlers, but he's also characters from the War of the Roses, and another character is also the same character from the War of the Roses, and there's other Thor characters like Gendry. And so this is sort of the beauty of what A Song of Ice and Fire is, and that's why I would just say there is so many podcasts and YouTube channels, because everyone has their different, like I'm not a huge War of the Roses guy, these guys are, I'm more into mythology, but George is into all of this stuff and manages to synthesize it all and then spin out a new story with it, and I just think that's worth stopping and appreciating. So.
Yeah, we know why it takes him so long, but it's worth it.
And that's why we don't rush them in, because it's other authors do what George does, but George does it harder, I would say. So.
Some of his most fun stuff is the stuff that he just, he has fun with. That House of Went was a black bat and a yellow oval. I mean, Batman, right? 1-1 is a giant. 1-1 is 11. Phil Simms for the New York Giants, his favorite football team. I mean,
well, so hold on. So Harrenhal has the Batman sigil because Arya is Batman. She sees both of her parents killed, then is trained by assassins in a foreign land, and then leaves the assassin's guild and comes back.
Exactly.
That's Batman.
One of the most fun ones, I think, is he had a character, I think it was pronounced Belichick or something, which was supposed to be
Bill Belichick,
and he was famously crushed by a giant, and he did that right after the Giants beat the Patriots in the Super Bowl.
After an undefeated run, after an undefeated string.
As a native New Englander and Patriots fan, that one hurt. But, and some of those, and there's a ton of them in there, and I don't think anybody except George knows all of them.
Yeah, there's some that are a little more blatant than others. I'm sure some people, you can't, if you've read World of Ice and Fire, Fire and Blood, you can't have missed Kermit, Elmo, and Grover Tully, and then Oscar Tully being added later. And if I might not have noticed that those Muppets correspond to the colors of the Trident. That's the point. That's like part of the extra layer. That even though George threw it in the joke, he crafted it a specific way.
And if I could shout out Shakespeare of Thrones in the crowd, she's wholly dedicated to uncovering Shakespearean influences in A Song of Ice and Fire, which are plentiful. So, absolutely, yeah. Chat with her afterward if she doesn't.
Even the show got in on the joke a little bit when they had Tyrion talking about cousin Orson crushing the bugs, Orson Scott Card. I don't know why they chose to put him out. I mean, I know he's controversial, but they singled him out, and it was pretty. That one wasn't that subtle.
Well, the Bran Ender parallels are pretty clear.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, that's true.
did a clue about what Bran's going to do, by the way.
He's gonna realize it's all a video game.
Not exactly where I was going, but
A Song of Ice and Fire is it's gonna pan back, and he's like, "Got another quarter? I need to play that again."
Video games are a quarter
Yeah. We started writing this in 1999.
Back when arcades were a thing.
Yeah. Okay, so let's. We've got a lot of other topics we can jump to. Who wants to move on to? Anyone ready with one that we want to jump to onto something else historical or non-historical?
I mean, I've got stuff ready.
Yeah, I might as well jump in with some of the Arthurian parallels.
Yeah.
again, like David was saying, very well put. George does not take things one for one. He's a synthesizer, and he's spoken about being influenced by the matter of Britain, which is the legends pertaining to King Arthur. And we look and at first glance you might think a variety. If you start to think about it, there's a variety of characters that could be similar to King Arthur. I mean, you have Arthur Dane, who has a legendary sword. Well, we can pass that one over because let's go right to Rhaegar and Jon Snow. Jon Snow is probably the one that people think of first as being this sort of prince that was born and then put into hiding, and he's kind of a prophecy savior for his world. But Rhaegar has a lot of parallels to King Arthur as well. And at the same time, Rhaegar has parallels to Lancelot, as does Jaime Lannister, sleeping with the Queen, for instance.
Being an amazing warrior, sleeping with the Queen.
Being and then back to Arthur Dane. Also he's the first knight. Well, that's one of my favorites that I could probably go a little bit deeper on. Arthur Dane is the first knight. He's a white knight, and Lancelot was in the early versions of the stories called the White Knight. Arthur Dane had or I should say, Lancelot had a tower that he called that was called Joyous Guard. It was called his home, and.
I don't get that reference. A tower called Joyous Guard?
Joyous Guard.
I don't get it.
What happened there?
Well, what happened? Lancelot, funnily enough, rescued Queen Guinevere from the flames. The king had sentenced her to burn for her crimes, and Lancelot came in and rescued her and whisked her away to Joyous Guard. Now, fast forward to Song of Ice and Fire, and one of my pet theories about Rhaegar and Lyanna. We have Lyanna, who appeared at the tourney of Harrenhal as the Knight of the Laughing Tree, and probably, if Aerys knew the truth of that, which I suspect he did, really fired up his paranoia. And his version of justice at that time was burning. So he may have wanted to burn Lyanna. And then you have somebody who showed up, whisked her away, and brought her to a tower, which he named the Tower of Joy. So
I'm still not seeing it.
So we go on and on.
thinking too hard about this.
Lyanna has Guinevere, and Ilya has Guinevere parallels. I mean, it's this sort of swirling soup of he takes these characters and takes bits and pieces of them and reformulates them for his own purposes, which makes it really fun for us.
So at that point, would you say that Rhaegar is Lancelot,
Yeah.
and then Robert essentially would have been Arthur?
I would say in that point, maybe I would maybe just leave Robert.
Almost becomes a role. Like he's not
Yeah.
really Arthur, but he's playing that role.
He's
Right.
He's
The
kind of like the
Arthur
cardboard cutout of Arthur because she's being stolen away from him. But really, in the mythology, Arthur was the one who sentenced Guinevere to burn, whereas in this proposed scenario, it was Aerys who was sentencing Lyanna to something possible murder. So I think it's indicative of the fact that he takes his parallels just so far, and then he twists them around and trots off in a different direction.
And of course, let's not forget the very on-the-nose name of Arthur's father.
Oh, Uther.
Yes.
Pendragon.
The Pendragon.
Which George recycles at House Hightower as the founder of House Hightower, Uther Hightower, who slayed dragons that
Right.
roosted at Battle Isle.
Yeah.
So.
So, and you can
The
take
circle is complete.
you can take the Pendragon, and then you can sort of apply stuff from that mythos right down to Jon Snow as well. And speaking of Jon Snow, you can take another element that is pretty prevalent in the later part of the Arthurian mythos, and that being the Knights Templar. And there are two really good analogs for the Knights Templar in Song of Ice and Fire. The first one, which seems to me to be the most obvious and the deepest, is the Night's Watch. But there's also the Poor Fellows and the Knights.
Warrior Sons.
The Warrior Sons. Their actual purpose, their stated purpose, and their words, if you will, are almost identical to the purpose of the Knights Templar. So he's taking those things. George has also said he's highly influenced by the Crusades, so it's no surprise that he talks about that stuff.
So let's move away from Europe and medieval stuff, even though that is very much a core of A Song of Ice and Fire, because you certainly have knights and lords running around and similar things to feudalism. But there's obviously, like LML said, there's so much that has been synthesized. We talk about deeper cuts, deeper parts of history, including really ancient history. Is some of the most fun stuff, I think. A good example is a segue here. We talk about Arthur Dane. He had a sword supposedly forged from a meteorite. Well, that's not fantasy. I mean, Dawn is. The way it comes out is fantasy, but the idea of meteorites being used to forge things before humans had the ability to forge things without meteors coming down. The point being, so I didn't explain that very well. A meteor passing through the atmosphere gets so hot that it's malleable in ways that ancient humans couldn't generate.
It's
that
a
kind of heat on
ready-made
their own.
iron alloy.
Yeah,
Oftentimes
they couldn't make that kind of heat on their own, but when it came through the atmosphere, it was temporarily hot enough to as if it was. Later, humans were able to develop that technology, but you have metal objects from thousands of years up to, like the first metal objects ever were in like 5000 BC, and that's well before there was metalworking. It was just because of this phenomenon. So LML has some really good examples of this phenomenon and related phenomena that we should talk about as well.
Yeah, so meteors have always been regarded as falling stars, the fire of the gods, something from heaven that falls down, because not only does it fall down in fire and glory and sound and explosions, then if you can find the rock, you can see that it's this very unique thing. It's metal, so it's unlike anything else that they had until you can forge iron and steel. So it made a big impact in world history. For example, the Ben stone that's all over Egyptian mythology. It was the capstone of the first pyramid. They used to keep it at Heliopolis. Basically, it's a meteor, and that led to all kinds of cool seed of the seed of the gods coming down kind of mythology. There's the Kaaba stone is thought to be a meteor. There is.
So the black stone that fell from the sky that the Emperor Elagabalus, the Roman Emperor Elagabalus, demanded that the whole empire worship. A little bit of a parallel to the Bloodstone Emperor of A Song of Ice and Fire, where he worshipped the black stone that fell from the sky that's supposedly ushered in the long night.
But actually, what's really cool is that, so I'm known for a theory, which I'm going to summarize in like 30 seconds. Basically, the long night was caused by a meteor. And it wasn't just a meteor attack, it was actually a comet, the previous version of the Red Comet, which seems to have gone around the sun, split in half, struck a moon. We used to have 2 moons, there's a legend about that. So you have this, and I'm going to summarize it here, guys. There's a lot of symbolism that backs this up. But essentially, through symbol, we were able to decode this pattern of a comet that gets split in half, with one half exploding in a moon and the other half keeps going. And so one of the parallels I found for this is the sword ice. Okay, if you remember, there's a scene in the books where Arya and Gendry looking at the red comet. Arya compares it to ice, red with Ned's blood. Okay, now what happens to ice? It gets split, and one half of it becomes Oathkeeper and it runs around and kills people. The other one is Widow's Wail. It kind of goes away. We don't see it for a while. So here's the interesting thing. At some point, I came up with this whole theory, right? So then someone pointed out to me that right around the time George was writing A Song of Ice and Fire, there was a little something called Comet Shoemaker Levy 9. In 1992, it broke apart and collided with Jupiter in 1994, providing the first direct observation of an extraterrestrial collision in the solar system object. And some of you who are my age, maybe a little older, remember that this was a pretty big deal. And we talked about it a lot. It was in the news. Every astronomer with a telescope looked at it. It was visible for a long time. And then all through the 90s, there was a couple more really cool comets, Hale-Bopp, and some other ones. So there's a lot of comet fever in the air right when George was writing this. And also then there was a book called Fingerprints of the Gods by Graham Hancock, which came out in 1994. Basically, it's a slightly more detailed theory of Atlantis, meaning that this guy Graham Hancock thinks that society actually used to be slightly more advanced around 10,000 BC-ish, and then kind of got knocked back. And it's a theory that, hey, you know, it's held up. Some people don't like it, some people do like it. Some parts are more correct than others. But the point is, this is a theory about a civilization that was destroyed by the end of the last ice age, and particularly these 3 meteor impacts that scientists now think occurred, I think it's like 7,000, 9,000, and about 11,000 BC. And these meteor impacts were timed with periods of heavy glacial flooding, glacial meltwater, because what happens with, and this is, now I'm getting into the Younger Dryas Comet, which is a more detailed information you guys might be aware of. But essentially, what a comet can do is it can torch an ice cap if it breaks apart, if it's big enough, and you get these glacial lakes that are already forming on top of the ice caps. You release all at once and they flood, or you just simply get a climate alteration with a large enough meteor impact that leads to the temporary ice age. But that's what the Younger Dryas was. It was 12 years of temporary ice age in a period of otherwise global warming. And so all these ideas have been filtered into a lot of the backstory of the Song of Ice and Fire. And not only the comet thing, but the Atlantis thing, like me and Aziz did a Great Empire of the Dawn panel earlier today. Great Empire of the Dawn is Atlantis in A Song of Ice and Fire. It's this glorious civilization that broke apart and eventually led to the creation of Valeria and other things, with Valeria being sort of analogous to like Egypt and Rome, as it's, you know, rumored to be the children of Atlantis, if you're into Atlantis sort of pseudoscience or whatever. But the really cool thing is that the Long Night should be seen as the flood myth of A Song of Ice and Fire. So the flood myth is everywhere. It's in like literally almost every culture, and it was the thing that led scientists to eventually realize that they needed to pay attention to mythology and not regard it as just silly stuff. And we eventually figured out that what the flood myths were is simply people remembering the meltdown of the ice caps that I was just talking about, because while it wasn't a global flood, they were floods big enough in a local area to essentially just wipe out everything that was there. And so you get these flood myths, and then you also have these periods of very rapid sea level rise within the course of like a century or something. And so the town that their grandparents used to live in, they now know is like under the ocean, like 50 feet off the shore. And so with the Long Night, it's a global myth that everybody has heard about, and people come up with different explanations for it. The gods, the Bloodstone Emperor did it, the Children of the Forest, you know, did it, whatever, Azor Ahai. But what's cool is that George has recreated this effect where it's a global event and everyone forms mythology around it. So these are some of the currents that I like to follow. It's mythology, but it's really like mythology that's based around real world events. And George loves to do that in A Song of Ice and Fire. So
yeah, it's really, and to go back to your point at the beginning of this panel, you talked about how George was inspired by thinking about how these guards on Hadrian's Wall would feel. And it's the same thing here. He's asking, what would it feel like to live through these global events that we don't have, that we have scientific perspective on now, even though we don't know what it's like to live through them, we at least can kind of explain it through science. At the time, if you're someone living through that, you have no perspective. Maybe you've heard of, if it was one of the later floods, maybe you have stories from your ancestors that they passed down of something like this long ago, but they didn't write it down. So it's going to be a story that's maybe morphed over time and be, you know, like a game of telephone, it grows into a myth, where it has a seed in reality, maybe a very strong seed, but it's, you know, it doesn't really resemble reality anymore the way it's told. But if you're in that spot where, let's say you have a volcano explode near you, or a meteor come down, and you are living in the year 8000 BC, it does seem like
apocalyptic.
Yeah, it's something. It makes sense that you would believe that there's beings
Gods
up
are
there
angry,
making decisions and throwing things down.
What did we do wrong?
Giving you gifts or taking things away, and just it's really fantastical and interesting to try to put yourself in the perspective of these ancient cultures, and I think that's where George, what George does a lot himself, into how he is able to find the best things to incorporate and synthesize is the ones that, if he puts, when he's putting himself in the place of these people that inspire him the most, the ones who say, wow, this would be quite a feeling. Like, what's
Right.
beyond the wall, or what's this meteor like to these people?
Because George is always banging on about the heart of conflict, like we always say. It's all about the characters. The characters are the only thing that matter, the main thing. And so he's looking for, when he's doing world building, or he's pulling from history, he's looking for the stuff that makes people feel things, feel conflicted, feel terrified, angry, like arouse these passions. So whatever you do with like the nerdy world building, the historical references, he's looking for the conflicts in the War of the Roses, for example, that put the hearts in conflict, and that's where the good story writing comes in. So
Yeah, it's a world building with emotional resonance in mind,
Yes.
like, at all times, because world building without, otherwise it's just static. You know, it's not memorable necessarily. It may be interesting, like be cool, but that's easier to do.
So we've got 10 minutes left, and I know we wanted to do a couple of, we'll give it time for the audience to chip in, and then we've got the Aria Start thing. So questions, or maybe your favorite little real world tidbit that you caught in a song by Sapphire that we haven't mentioned.
Can you guys say anything about the black dinner?
Sir, I'm sorry, what in the gray sweater?
Eggman?
Frog
Frog boy.
You're talking about the red wedding. And-
Yeah, the
it's
black
connected-
dinner and the red wedding.
The black dinner.
Did you
Black
guys
dinner.
Do it.
talk about that?
Yeah.
Yeah, she probably has a better grasp. I've got a kind of high-end grasp, but
Great start and
yeah, I mean, George actually used two references for that, really. I mean, there's the Black Dinner, where, famously the two clans in Scotland had been feuding. He invited them over, like, let's make peace, and then actually served him a severed bull's head under the thing. The Scots have some really weird symbolism, but apparently that's like, I'm going to kill you here. And the larger one, which is probably because of the sheer size of the Red Wedding, would be the Glencoe Massacre between the McDonald's and the Campbells. So yes,
Never-ending struggle.
They had stayed there for, I believe it was 14 days under their roof, under guest right, and then in the middle of the night slaughtered the entirety of them. I know that the General Superintendent probably knows a little bit more on the details, but those were his two inspirations, which he's actually talked about a few times in there.
and if that about covers it, that you just have these two amazingly bloody conflicts from real world history, and he takes them, mushes them together in his story because he wants to turn it up to 11. So he takes, one thing that was bad, and then he takes another thing that was even worse, puts them together, and makes something that is the most horrible thing you could ever imagine. And by the way, we say turn up to 11, and I think that comes from George,
Yeah.
but that is also a real world. That is also a real world reference.
11.
It goes to
Let's
that.
get to 11.
What about the Red Wedding and the Banquet of Blood? About the Umayyads.
I can't wait to
So the
see
Abbasids killed the Umayyads at a banquet, and now in Arabic, Asifa, the caliph that did it, if you are Asifa, you are the spiller of blood. You are actually a serial killer. But, and to bring the reference over, one Umayyad survived, made it all the way to Spain, and then this lost heir came out of nowhere and established an empire.
Oh, nice. That's cool.
Yeah, the other interesting thing that George did with the Red Wedding was he put the phrase in the middle of it, and the phrase real world counterparts would be the Stanleys, right, who famously switched sides more times than I think you could possibly count. Basically there were the two brothers, and whenever there was a conflict, they would each pick a side. And then whoever won would get the other one apart. So, they basically hedged their bets, and then finally, in Richard III's last stand, I think everybody knows he had declared for Richard, but then just before the battle, I think it was, basically switched and said Tudor.
So if you take that concept there and think about how George applied it to this house, the phrase, he also uses it in a meta way by having them control both sides of the river. That's their
They're double
kind of,
cross.
double cross, it's the double crossing.
Straddling the fence.
It's straddling both sides, it just fits it. So he takes the idea and synthesizes it into a physical manner with kind of how they're in their house mythology. So it's just a good example of multiple levels of synthesis there.
Well, I was just gonna say that last bit you brought up about the Stanleys also reminds me of the Swans, where I think it was the Swans. Where
Swans and the High Towers, a few
with
examples.
Lord Swan very specifically sends one son to each camp at the beginning of the war.
Yeah, and again, he uses the same thing in multiple different places. I mean, there's multiple kingmakers, right? The Earl of Warwick was obviously famously the kingmaker, who basically tried to, when the first king, Edward IV, he was fed up with, he went and tried to switch and back his brother. Very political type person, forced his daughters into marriages that they didn't want, very Tywin Lannister type thing. But then there's other characters within there in the Bloodfire or the Blackfire Rebellion and stuff. So he's definitely used these in multiple places.
Yeah, and Warwick even uses a new kind of a new version of Warwick in Fire and Blood with Rogar Baratheon, who was also kind of like Roger Mortimer. There's a Rogar. That's a good example of multiple characters being thrown into one personality in the story.
Historical event that nobody knows about, but it's probably the most important thing. There was a real world long night. It was like 1816 or 1817. That due to a volcanic eruption on the other side of the world, just literally spring never came.
1848, Krakatoa.
Yeah, Krakatoa, I was about to say.
And it's religions were created. It basically caused the Napoleonic Wars. Everybody's got ancestors that came to the United States in 1820. You know why? Because there was no food in Europe. It caused all kinds of weird
Migrations.
So you have this real world long night, and then George dials out to
Most importantly for
11. Massive
George-
starvation, massive freezing, White Walkers.
It's actually,
Well, Lord Byron's poem Darkness is specifically about that year, and if you read the poem Darkness, it is the long night. And George uses the poem Darkness in Fever Dream and in other works, so it's clearly something
It's
that's
clear
on
that
his
he's
mind.
influenced by
He
that.
uses some literal things. I mean, at one point, the kings in Scotland were known as the kings in the north. Right? So, I mean, some things are very, very literal with what he's referencing to. But, yeah, I mean, think of the primitive things and like a volcano. Oh, my God, the gods are
nobody
going.
knew. I mean,
Imagine
you would-
what they did when the aliens showed up.
Think what the state of science was in 1816, and you would open a paper, and a scientist would say, well, we're not sure what's going on, but it appears that the sun's going out.
Right.
Say your
the
prayers.
sun's
it's over.
burned out.
Right.
And that's a great point too, because they don't have to be right.
Right.
It's how these people perceived it. It doesn't have anything to do with what's real. George doesn't even care about telling us what's real. He's not going to tell us whether the gods are real or any of this stuff. He's just going to tell us how all the characters feel about it and what they think.
And I'll go to you in a second, Euron. And the last part of this is that we see George using Daenerys to show how mythology is created in real time. We see people talking about Daenerys halfway around the world, and she's already becoming a legend and a myth. We're hearing things that are only half true. So this is like within like a year of things that she's doing or less, she's already being mythicized because she's that sort of titanic, world-striding figure. So George loves to show you that kind of process at different points. But yes, go ahead.
Yeah, you just mentioned Danny. I was just wondering if you think about.
Oh, you're thinking about Danny? Are you?
Well,
You're-
other historical women. So reading about the War of the Roses, you have like Elizabeth Whitfield and Margaret Beaufort and Margaret d'Anjou. You definitely see a lot of Sarah Sansa and Catelyn all over the place. Are there other female figures do you think influenced George in history?
Oh yeah, there's a lot of good ones. We were going to talk about Grace O'Malley, right?
Right.
Yes, indeed. Well, this is actually, Ray has this great story about George using Grace O'Malley as his inspiration
So
for Asha.
if you can't tell, I support the greatest house in Westeros, the Greyjoys. This is primarily because I'm of Irish descent. I did the DNA. I'm 55% Irish. My surname's Irish, and you know they're really based on the Kingdom of the Isles that were there. So the Norse Gaels that came out, the Vikings that decided, hey, we like this place. It's kind of nice, you know, and they intermarried. They absorbed their religion, their cultures, their language. So they were really more Irish than Norse at that point, or more Gaelic, I should say. And then they populated the Isles. And there's a lot of stories. We could go on for an hour of different ones. But specifically, I got to ask George at San Diego, I think it was 2013. I just bought my headless Ned Stark pop. I remember that, and he signed it. I didn't ask him to. The guy just scribbled on it. It's like, you know, they're just showing it to him. But I said, can I ask you a question? And he immediately put the armor on, right? Because he thought he was going to get who's Jon Snow's mother or something like that, right? And I just said, is Asha Greyjoy based on Grace O'Malley? And he went, oh, Grenya. Yes, of course. In fact, I've had both a cat and a dog named after her. So he's very much, he loves the Pirate Queen, right? I mean, that's, everybody knows her. She captained 100 ships, I think. It was about 100 ships. This woman went toe-to-toe with Queen Victoria, all right? She kidnapped her family, basically took them hostage, went into England, went to the palace. I mean, there's paintings of it, of them facing each other, and said, okay, I will stop my pirating ways, release my family. They came to an agreement, woman to woman. I think roughly about a year later, she started pirating again, but you know, it lasted for a while.
I wonder if that could be some foreshadowing.
It could, I think it is. I think it absolutely is, and I think the show's kind of already gone there. But I think Asha's going to end up ruling the Iron Islands. I think that's where it's going to end up.
Love it. Love it.
Yeah, yeah, and I think,
Asha Queen.
and if going back to the War of the Roses, if Dany has to sacrifice Jon as Azor Ahai and then take her throne, you know, just like Henry Tudor had to kill Richard III to claim his throne, and then you've got the queens matching up. I can totally see that ending that way.
Very interesting.
That's my theory.
So we're right at 6:50. It's time to give away that Funko Pop.
Absolutely. Julie, can you come up with the tickets? Let's pick a winner.
Real quick too, while this is coming up, I want to just throw out a couple of random ones. Without going into detail, compare the Mexica/Aztecs to the Children of the Forest. Compare examples, compare the anecdote of Crassus to the scene with Viserys getting the gold for his head.
Compare the Brotherhood Without Banners to Robin Hood and His Merry Men.
What we got? Ba-ba.
And the winner is, oh God, I do not have my glasses. Let me see.
689-062. 062.
Winner, chicken dinner. You win nothing. I mean, no.
He's got a Stark shirt. He deserved it.
Thank you all for coming.
Thank you.
Thanks, guys.